Is oil starting to leak onto your spark plugs? Do you see dribbles like this beneath the valve cover? Or dribbles leaking onto the exhaust manifold, creating thick black smoke? If so, stay tuned. First, we have some things we need to get out of the way before we can lift up the valve cover and replace the gasket. We have this hose in front here and two ventilation hoses in the back. Then the two wires on the passenger side running along the edge here. I already loosened the hose clamp, and now I'm going to turn the hose from side to side to break it free from the pipe. Next, we need to get the wires out of the way. This one can simply be moved back without disconnecting it. This is the clip that fastens the valve cover to the timing belt cover. Remove that now. The other two clips are on the side. Now we can peel back the timing belt cover just enough to lift out the valve cover when we come to that step. But first, this might be a good time to disconnect the battery. We don't want to get any electrical shorts. To get the other wire out of the way, we need to remove the spark plug cover first. This is the second wire. It's connected to a plug that recedes down into this short recess. Press in the tabs with a pair of needle nose pliers and lift up. Now all the wires and hoses are out of the way. Next, we can pull the spark plug wires. Then unscrew the 10 8mm bolts that fasten the valve cover to the head of the engine. Lift up with a stiff tug and it should come off. If it doesn't, you may have to pry it off, gently. Before putting on a new gasket, let's make sure the valve cover is in good shape. We don't want to spend all this time replacing the gasket only to realize there's something wrong with the valve cover as well. With our cover, it's the oil fill hole that's bad. The threads are busted out. We need a new cover as well as a gasket, and since Suzuki charges over $400 for an OEM replacement, that means we need to take a little trip. found a Forenza in the import section outdoors. Maybe we could salvage a valve cover off this one. Here's one that isn't burnt out. The valve cover is laying there just like that. The car is an '04 Suzuki Forenza. The oil cap is good. The ears are still intact. And the threads aren't busted out like the old ones. Better yet, it costs less than $10. I cleaned up the valve cover, and now I'm using a pick to remove the 10 O-ring seals from the screw posts. After you've done that, the important thing is cleaning the groove where your gasket is going to sit. You want to make sure all the old sealant is brushed and picked out of the groove. You want the groove nice and clean for your new gasket. You might have this mess to deal with if oil leaked down into the spark plug wells. I'm using a hand pump to suck out the oil. Then I'll spray a can of brake cleaner and I'll suck that out as well. I'm using a Felpro gasket. The label says it can be applied to several different makes and models, including your Suzuki Forenza and Reno. The box includes 4 spark plug seals, the 10 O-rings, and the gasket itself. For our Suzuki Forenza, at least, you won't be needing these 4 spark plug tube seals. And that's because the gasket seals all the way around this middle area here where the spark plugs are. So you can set these aside. You don't need them. Next, I'm using a very small dab of RTV to glue the O-rings into place. I don't want any of them popping out when we turn the valve cover over. The gasket itself doesn't need any sealant at this point. It's designed to stay in place after you press it into the groove. Now we can start preparing the mating surface where the valve cover gasket comes into contact with the engine. I'm using a putty knife and a razor blade for the tougher areas. Suzuki released a technical service bulletin on the issue of leaking valve covers because they realized it was becoming a problem. The bulletin tells us we should deal with the problem by applying RTV sealant to the surface of the cylinder head, rather than using a dry install without sealant, and that the RTV should be height temperature and oil resistant, and of course to be sure the cylinder head sealing surfaces are completely clean and degreased. I'm using Permatex Ultra-Black, and I'm applying, as well as I can, a continuous and even bead to the surface. Install the valve cover while the RTV is still wet. If, at this point, you want to go ahead and torque down the bolts, feel free. I'm not going to. I'm going to wait until the RTV is tacky before torquing all the way down. I'm proceeding as if we have a form-in-place gasket. I'm going this extra mile because these Suzuki valve cover gaskets are so problematic. Permatex wants us to only finger tighten the screws until RTV begins to seep from the sides. In other words, don't tighten the screws all the way down just yet. We want to wait until the RTV has had time to cure. Normally, this would take a couple hours, and then we could torque the bolts all the way down. But today it's cold, and the sealant isn't anywhere near being dry after 2 hours. What we'll do is reattach the hoses and wires, and then torque everything down tomorrow morning. It's 21 degrees this morning. The RTV hasn't completely dried yet, but it's dry enough to proceed to the next step. I'm torquing down each bolt to 71 inch-pounds, going in a crisscross pattern, starting from the center bolts outward to the edge. Make sure all the wires and hoses are reconnected. Start up the engine and check for any oil leaks. If there aren't any, you're good to go.